Okay. Hello, everyone. It's Father Will, and these video series that I'm about to do are hopefully going to help us with the homily series we've been doing, this walkthrough of the Mass. It's been kind of starting out with what the Mass is, and in these videos, we're hoping to have more of the kind of signs and symbols that we see and the things that we use for Mass, for worship of God. Starting out today, I wanted to go over the altar. Of course, altar is an important part of worship. It's an important part of Mass, but it's something that's so familiar to us that we kind of just overlook it. The fact that we gather around this, in our case, this kind of rectangular stone in the middle of our church every Sunday and even every day for Mass. And just want to go over a little bit of its history and why we have it, why we use it, and what it's for. And so, of course, we have altars are not something unique to Christians, right? Altars go back all the way to not just pre-Christianity in the Jewish religion, but in fact, pretty much every religion of old had some kind of altar, because pretty much every ancient religion had this idea of sacrifice, had this idea that sacrifice was necessary to worship God. And in this idea of sacrifice, of course, you had to actually make that sacrifice somewhere. And so altars became a thing. And they range from kind of giant altars that are square in ancient Rome, pagan altars you can still go and see today, were actually usually pretty small, little squares you could just kind of have burnt offerings on top of. But even in the Jewish temple, that we know that there were altars in the Jewish temple for sacrifice, for offering sacrifices to God. And so, of course, we know that, right after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the apostles are going around and evangelizing the world, preaching the gospel and saying Mass. And it seems like from the earliest days of the church that although the first Masses, the first altars were probably wooden, were probably more something that could be easily transported because Christians were hiding out. The Christianity was illegal, and oftentimes they had to move from one place to another. But also, there's a good chance that altars also were at first, there were altars of stone, there were altars of marble, because it was common in the early church before Christianity was legalized that in the catacombs, those kind of underground burial chambers that Christians were buried in, is actually where a lot of times they would go and have Mass, where they would go and worship. And we can go and see those same places today and see that there's kind of these kind of nooks and crannies in these catacombs, these underground burial chambers, especially over the tombs of the martyrs, especially over those who gave up their life for Jesus. And that was especially somewhere that Christians wanted to worship, that they knew that this person was with God, that they lived a holy life on earth. And so, of course, this is where they wanted to receive inspiration and pray to God and believe that, yes, like this person can help us with their prayers to get to heaven one day as well. And of course, after Christianity is legalized, we have a big change. We have all of these new laws and all of this new creativity coming about because we don't have to hide in basements of houses and the catacombs anymore. Christians can worship freely in public. And so we start building these big, beautiful churches. And of course, the question comes up about altars. How do we build altars? And it seems like as soon as Christianity is legalized, there's this idea that the altar should be fixed, should be stone in most cases, and even pretty early on, having these 5 crosses on the altar that you'll notice in the 4 corners and even in the center. And all of these things have deep symbolism, deep value. One of the reasons that we have an altar in a kind of rectangle is calling all the way back to having Mass on the tombs of the martyrs. That in a real way, it's meant to represent kind of a tomb. It's meant to represent a burial chamber. And of course, we don't just remember the saints, and oftentimes we don't have one at our altar, but there are many altars that have relics of saints still to this day. But it's not just that, but also, of course, we know that Jesus was buried in the tomb. And so we not only recall the lives of the saints, of the martyrs, but we even recall the death of Jesus. And of course, we know that we're not just recalling his death. We're not morbid just to be morbid, but we know that we can look in the face of death, in the face of a tomb, and we can still have hope. We can still have joy because we know that Jesus conquered the grave. He conquered the tomb. That sin and death no longer have power over us because Jesus reigns. And on top of that, back to that symbolism of Jesus, these 5 crosses that are in the altar as well even represent the 5 wounds of Jesus. Of course, his hands and his feet and in his side. And so really the altar in a real way is meant to represent Jesus himself, that Jesus who suffered and died for us, but ultimately Jesus who rose from the dead for us and ascended into heaven. And so this altar, this place of sacrifice, of course, we remember that Jesus, received these wounds where he was buried in the tomb, of course, becomes a symbol of not death, but hope. And it becomes a symbol of our worship. And it helps us to draw our minds and our hearts closer to the Lord. It helps us to lift up our minds and our hearts to that heavenly worship. And there's some other things that could be said about altars, but hopefully that's enough for now to kind of help us to enter more deeply into the Mass and to pray more fully with the Lord. And of course, any questions that anyone has, feel free to reach out if there's anything that we're not answering in these videos, anything that would be of particular interest. I would be happy to cover those as well. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.